I told you to stay away from her! Get out of my face!
That is enough. Stop this behavior immediately and stand down.
Thug tried to punch a veteran in front of the royal guard, but instantly got put in his place. The golden sunlight reflected off the tall, old stone buildings, giving the area a warm, almost magical glow. The cobblestone streets were busy, crowded with families taking pictures, street performers entertaining passers-by, and small vendors selling souvenirs. Among all the movement and chatter, a sense of excitement filled the air because people knew they were near a place of history and honor. Standing tall and composed at one side of the square was the Royal Guard, dressed in crisp uniforms, their polished boots gleaming under the sun. They had trained for years to maintain discipline, standing perfectly still even when the crowd pressed closer to take pictures or wave. Their faces were serious, almost stern, but there was a quiet dignity in the way they held themselves. They were symbols of order and respect, and everyone gave them their space, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the palace grounds. Not far from the guards, near the edge of the square, walked a man who seemed like he belonged to another world entirely. He was a veteran, a former soldier whose life had been shaped by discipline, training, and countless experiences that few civilians could imagine. His posture was straight, his movements calm, and his eyes observant. He wasn't in uniform today, but the way he carried himself spoke volumes. There was an unspoken authority in his presence. People might have glanced at him and thought he was just another tourist, yet there was an aura of quiet confidence that made others give him a little more space. Meanwhile, a few meters away, tension was quietly building. A thug, a young man with a restless energy and a short temper, moved through the crowd with a swagger that immediately drew attention. He was loud and brash, muttering under his breath as he shoved past people, clearly irritated by the flow of the crowd. His eyes scanned the square, looking for someone who might challenge him, someone who might react to his provocation. It was the kind of energy that made people nervous without them fully understanding why. The veteran noticed the thug immediately. He could sense the brewing trouble in the way the young man's shoulders tensed, in the sharp, unpredictable movements of his hands. The veteran had seen people like this before, people who tried to assert control through aggression, who misjudged others and thought their size or anger could win any encounter. He didn't move toward the thug. Instead, he stayed calm, letting his presence speak for him. There was a quiet patience in the way he watched, an understanding that some conflicts were best handled with restraint rather than speed. The thug, on the other hand, was unaware that he was being observed. He muttered insults to himself, pacing near a small group of tourists who were busy taking photos. His frustration seemed to grow with each passing second, and he started looking for someone to challenge. He needed attention, someone to acknowledge his presence, and his eyes eventually fell on the veteran. At first, he didn't recognize him for who he was, a trained ex-soldier with years of experience. But he saw the calm demeanor and straight posture and immediately felt provoked. It started with a shove, small and almost accidental. The thug brushed past the veteran, too close for comfort. The veteran barely moved, simply turning slightly to avoid contact. "Watch where you're going," the thug muttered, his voice low but aggressive, trying to assert dominance. The veteran didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was a subtle challenge, a signal that the thug's behavior would not intimidate him. The crowd began to sense the tension. People paused in their steps, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Street performers stopped mid-act, and tourists lowered their cameras. There was a ripple of unease, a quiet recognition that conflict was about to happen, even though no one could predict how it would end. The thug's frustration mounted. "Who does he think he is?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He clenched his fists, bouncing on the balls of his feet. His eyes darted between the veteran and the royal guard, noticing their stoic presence but daring them with a reckless confidence. He didn't care about rules or authority. He only cared about proving that he was not afraid. The veteran, however, stayed perfectly still, his mind calm and clear. He could feel the thug's anger, but he didn't feel threatened. Years of training had taught him to read people, to anticipate their moves without reacting in haste. He knew that confrontation was not about strength alone, but about timing, control, and patience. He allowed the thug to vent, letting the young man believe he had the upper hand, even though the situation was already under the veteran's silent control. A small group of bystanders began to gather, sensing that a scene might unfold. Whispers spread through the crowd. Is he going to fight him? What's happening? Should we step back? No one moved too close, out of respect for the royal guard and an instinctive sense that the veteran was different from ordinary people. His calm energy seemed to command the space around him. The thug made the first real move. He stepped closer, his body language aggressive, his fists slightly raised. He wanted a reaction, some kind of acknowledgement that the veteran felt threatened. Yet the veteran didn't flinch. His face remained composed, almost serene. There was no anger, no fear, only quiet awareness. This only made the thug angrier. He didn't understand why the veteran didn't respond, why his usual tactics of intimidation were failing. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the royal guard, trained to ignore disturbances, subtly shifted their posture, sensing that something serious could happen. The veteran's eyes didn't leave the thug, but they were calm, measured, and unthreatened. Every detail was registered. The young man's stance, his tension, the way his fists twitched. The veteran knew that if the thug made a mistake, it would be his last. And then, without warning, the thug raised his fist. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was an attempt to strike, a desperate effort to assert dominance in front of witnesses. The crowd gasped, stepping back in alarm. The veteran didn't flinch. He didn't raise his own hands yet. He was ready, poised, a rock of calm in the storm of the thug's aggression. In that tense moment, everything in the square seemed to pause. Children clutched their parents' hands. Tourists froze mid-photo. Even the royal guard's eyes narrowed slightly, evaluating the unfolding situation. It was a moment that could have escalated into chaos, or it could end in a lesson no one would forget. The veteran's silence and steady gaze were louder than any words. The thug's anger had built to a peak, but he had underestimated his opponent. The veteran's calm was not weakness. It was the product of years of discipline, training, and understanding of human behavior. The thug, blinded by his own frustration, was walking straight into a trap he didn't even realize existed. As the thug swung his fist toward the veteran, the crowd instinctively recoiled. But the veteran's eyes were steady, unafraid, and for the first time, the thug sensed that he might have miscalculated. He expected fear, he expected panic, but what he got instead was the stillness of someone who had faced far worse than him. And in that quiet, charged moment, the story of what would happen next hung in the air like electricity. Everyone knew something remarkable was about to unfold, but no one could predict exactly how the confrontation would end. The tension in the square was palpable, the crowd silent and the royal guard alert. The veteran didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone told the story. Discipline, courage, and control were on his side. The thug, blinded by anger and the desire to dominate, was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The sun had begun its slow descent in the sky, casting a softer light across the palace square. Shadows stretched across the cobblestones, and the crowd of tourists, locals, and street performers seemed to move a little slower now, as if the tension in the air had made them pause. Every person in the square could sense that something was about to happen, though no one knew exactly what. The thug had taken a step closer to the veteran, his anger boiling inside him. He muttered under his breath, trying to psych himself up to find the courage to show dominance. "He thinks he can just stand there, huh?" he muttered, fists twitching nervously. His breathing had grown heavier, chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked around at the growing crowd, some people taking photos with their phones, others simply watching in disbelief. For the thug, it felt like a stage, and he wanted to be the center of attention. The veteran, however, remained calm. He had learned long ago that confrontation was often won before it even began. It wasn't about throwing the first punch or showing force. It was about control. His eyes studied the young man carefully, noting every detail. The way his feet shifted from side to side, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the quick glances he kept giving to the royal guard. The veteran knew that this young man had never faced someone truly trained, someone who had endured challenges far greater than a public square disagreement. The crowd around them had begun to inch backward, giving them space. Some whispered to each other, trying to make sense of the tension. "Is he really going to hit him?" a woman whispered, clutching her child's hand. "I don't know," her friend replied, "but the older man looks calm. Maybe he knows what he's doing." The murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder as people tried to anticipate what would happen next. The thug's impatience grew with each passing second. He could feel the eyes of the people around him, and it made him even more determined to act. He wanted to prove something, not just to the veteran, but to himself and the audience of onlookers. He lifted his hand, balling it into a fist, and raised it toward the veteran. He swung it forward quickly, hoping to catch the older man off guard. But the veteran didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady and his body relaxed, almost like he was preparing for a simple, controlled movement. Years of military training had taught him to anticipate attacks, to read subtle shifts in weight and posture that indicated intent. He could tell exactly what the young man was planning, and he knew the precise moment to respond. He shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself in a way that would make the thug's punch ineffective without needing to strike back aggressively. The thug's fist passed just inches from the veteran's face, and the crowd gasped in surprise. Many stepped back, some holding their phones up to record the incident, others shielding their eyes in fear. The young man froze for a fraction of a second, shocked that his attack hadn't landed. His eyes widened as he realized that the veteran wasn't reacting the way he expected. Fear, the thing that usually made others yield, didn't exist in this man. "Move out of the way," the thug shouted, trying to intimidate the veteran, thinking that loud words could compensate for his failed strike. He shifted his stance, readying himself to swing again, more aggressively this time. His fists clenched tightly, knuckles white, and his jaw was set firmly. He believed that this time he would succeed, that the veteran would finally show some reaction, some fear. But the veteran stayed calm. He spoke softly but firmly in a voice that carried just enough to be heard by the thug. "Step back. You don't want this," he said. His words were deliberate, measured, and carried an authority that came from experience. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The thug sneered, thinking this was weakness. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Step back. Who do you think you are?" he spat. "You think you're better than me?" The veteran didn't respond. His silence was intentional. He knew that reacting with anger would only escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on maintaining balance, observing the thug's every move. The young man's movements were sharp but reckless, lacking control. He relied on aggression, assuming it would be enough to overpower anyone. But the veteran understood that strength alone was never enough. Control, precision, and patience were far more powerful. The crowd began to murmur again, tension rising. Children clung tightly to their parents, and some older tourists exchanged worried glances. Yet, amidst all the tension, there was a sense of awe. The veteran's calm, steady presence made people unconsciously take a step back. Even the Royal Guard, who had been trained to handle emergencies, shifted slightly, recognizing that this was no ordinary situation. The thug's frustration boiled over. He moved faster, swinging his fist again, this time with more force, more desperation. But the veteran anticipated the attack, shifting his weight at just the right moment. The punch glanced harmlessly past him, missing its mark entirely. The young man stumbled slightly from the failed attempt, his momentum carrying him forward, and the crowd collectively gasped. "Enough," the veteran said quietly, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. It wasn't a threat, but it carried an invisible weight. The young man froze for a moment, confused by the unshakable calm in front of him. He had expected panic, a flinch, some sign of fear, but there was none. This made him angrier but also slightly cautious. He hadn't encountered anyone like this before. The thug's breathing grew faster, his fists trembling slightly. He tried to regain control, taking another swing, but he was no longer precise. His movements were hurried, reactive, driven by anger rather than thought. And the veteran, still calm, was ready. He didn't strike. He simply positioned himself so that the thug could not reach him effectively, using minimal energy, just enough to stay safe. Around them, the crowd continued to hold its breath. Phones were raised, recording the unfolding drama, while some people muttered quietly among themselves. "He's not even moving," one person whispered. "How is he not scared?" Another replied. "He's been trained. You can see it in the way he's standing. That's no ordinary man." The thug's frustration reached its peak. He shouted, trying to scare the veteran, but the older man's calm gaze never wavered. It was a battle of wills now, a test of patience and control. The young man didn't realize that by acting recklessly, he had already lost the first round. Confidence, experience, and composure were silently winning the moment. The Royal Guard took notice. They remained in position, but subtle movements showed that they were ready. They had seen their fair share of incidents in the square, but something about this particular confrontation demanded their attention. The veteran's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the thug's wild energy, making the young man's actions appear even more reckless. Then the veteran spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "You don't want to do this," he said. The words were simple, but every syllable carried weight. The thug hesitated for a brief second, confused by the unwavering authority in the older man's voice. It was as if the veteran was invisible, yet somehow completely in control of the situation. The crowd leaned forward slightly, sensing the critical moment was approaching. The thug clenched his fists one more time, readying for another swing. But there was a subtle change in his body language: hesitation, doubt, uncertainty. For the first time, he questioned his own actions, realizing that his aggression might not achieve what he had imagined. The veteran remained still, his breathing steady, his eyes never leaving the young man. He understood the psychology of confrontation. Aggression could be answered with strength, yes, but wisdom could end it before violence even occurred. His calm, controlled presence was slowly shifting the balance of power. Around them, whispers continued, growing louder. People speculated about what would happen next. "He's not scared at all," one man said. "This older man, he's amazing," a woman added. "I think the young man is going to regret this. He doesn't even realize who he's facing." The crowd's attention was fully on the two figures, the square silent except for the occasional muttered comment. The thug's anger surged one final time. He moved faster than before, swinging wildly, hoping to finally land a hit. But the veteran had already anticipated it. With minimal movement, he positioned himself perfectly to avoid the strike, redirecting the energy harmlessly. The thug stumbled forward off balance, and the crowd gasped again. The realization hit the young man: he was no match. In that moment, time seemed to slow for the thug. The fear he had never expected to feel began to creep in. He looked at the veteran, and for the first time he saw the calm authority that had been invisible until now. The older man wasn't just avoiding his attacks. He was teaching a silent lesson about control, patience, and discipline. The crowd watched in awe. Children clutched their parents' hands tightly, some eyes wide with wonder. Tourists whispered, amazed at the veteran's skill and composure. Even the royal guard, trained to remain stoic, shared subtle nods of respect. The veteran had turned a moment of potential violence into a display of quiet authority and experience, and the square had become a stage for a lesson that would not be forgotten. The square was quiet now, but the silence was heavy, full of tension. The crowd had circled slightly, giving the two figures, the thug and the veteran, room to move. Everyone was watching, some with phones raised, some simply holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The sunlight glinted off the cobblestones, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the figures like fingers of anticipation. The thug's frustration was visible. His fists were still clenched, muscles tight, and his eyes darted nervously between the veteran and the royal guard. He had tried 3 times to strike, and each time his attacks had failed. He was starting to realize that this older man was not ordinary, and that realization only fueled his anger. He wanted to dominate, to assert himself, to show that he was not afraid. Yet every instinct told him he had underestimated his opponent. The veteran, by contrast, stood calm and composed. He had not raised his voice, he had not struck first, but his presence alone had shifted the balance. Years of experience had taught him that confrontation was not about reacting quickly, but about controlling the moment. He could see exactly how the young man moved, predict his next attack, and respond with precision. His body was relaxed yet ready, a combination of patience and skill that could neutralize the threat without unnecessary force. For a brief moment, the thug hesitated. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the murmurs and whispers growing louder. "What's going to happen?" people asked each other. "Will he finally get hit?" The young man's chest rose and fell rapidly, and his fists twitched as he struggled to decide what to do next. Anger and pride clashed inside him, creating a storm of impulsive energy that made him reckless. The veteran studied him carefully. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His calm demeanor was already sending a message. Control, discipline, and experience mattered more than aggression. Yet he knew the young man would not stop until he had tried to strike again. So he prepared himself, ready to respond with measured action, not anger. This was not a fight to prove strength. It was a moment to teach a lesson without unnecessary harm. The thug lunged forward once more, faster this time, thinking that a sudden, forceful move would finally overpower the veteran. His fist swung wide, fueled by frustration and adrenaline. But the veteran had anticipated it. With a small, controlled shift of his body, he avoided the strike entirely, letting the thug's momentum carry him slightly forward. The move was subtle, almost invisible, yet completely effective. The crowd gasped. Some stepped back in surprise, while others whispered among themselves. "Did you see that?" one woman said. He didn't even touch him, and the young man stumbled. Children looked wide-eyed at the scene, holding their parents' hands tightly. Even the royal guard, who were trained to remain composed in any situation, subtly adjusted their stance, recognizing the veteran's skill and control. The thug staggered slightly, but he didn't give up. His pride would not allow it. He clenched his fists again, jaw tight, and swung once more, this time with both hands in a clumsy attempt to grab the veteran. His movements were growing more erratic, less coordinated. He was tiring both physically and mentally, while the veteran remained calm, his breathing steady, his posture perfect. "Stop!" the veteran said this time, his voice quiet but firm. It carried authority without anger, and for a brief second the thug hesitated. He wasn't used to being addressed this way. He was used to fear, panic, or immediate submission, none of which the veteran showed. The words sank in, though, planting a seed of doubt. Was it possible he had misjudged this man entirely? But the thug's pride would not let him back down. He swung again, even faster, but this time his movements were sloppy. The veteran stepped lightly to the side, letting the young man's own momentum guide him. The thug stumbled forward, barely regaining balance, and the crowd murmured in astonishment. "He's like water," someone whispered. "He moves but never reacts in anger. He's controlling everything." The veteran didn't strike. He didn't need to. His presence alone was teaching the thug a lesson. Yet he knew the moment for decisive action had come. The young man had become reckless, overconfident, and unbalanced. All that remained was to redirect his energy safely, without causing unnecessary harm, while making the point unmistakably clear. The thug swung one final time with all his remaining strength, desperate to land a hit. But the veteran was ready. In a single, fluid movement, he guided the thug's arm away, using minimal force to maintain control. The young man's own energy carried him slightly forward, off balance, and he stumbled onto the cobblestones. The crowd gasped loudly, some covering their mouths in disbelief. The thug scrambled to his feet, red-faced, breathing heavily. His anger was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion and embarrassment. He had expected victory, or at least a reaction of fear, but the veteran had not only avoided harm, he had completely neutralized the situation. The lesson was clear. Aggression without control was useless against experience and discipline. The veteran took a calm step forward, his eyes never leaving the young man. He spoke quietly, each word deliberate. "You wanted to show strength. You failed. You could have hurt yourself or someone else. This ends now." His voice carried authority, the kind that comes not from anger but from absolute confidence in one's abilities. The thug froze, realizing that the veteran was not joking. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, and for the first time he felt genuine fear, not of the crowd, not of the royal guard, but of the man standing before him. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had underestimated someone completely, and that his pride had led him into a situation he could not control. Around them, the crowd exhaled collectively. Some whispered in awe. "I've never seen anything like this," one person said. "He didn't even hit him, and he stopped him completely." Children clung to their parents wide-eyed. Tourists lowered their phones, realizing that what they had just witnessed was more than a spectacle. It was a lesson in control, patience, and discipline. The royal guard moved slightly closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but it wasn't needed. The veteran had already ensured that the situation was under control. His calm energy radiated across the square, and even the thug seemed to shrink under its weight. The young man's aggression had been transformed into a moment of learning without a single unnecessary strike thrown. The thug tried to speak, but his words faltered. I didn't mean," he stammered, his pride struggling to accept the lesson. The veteran shook his head slightly, still calm. "Think carefully next time. Anger and pride are dangerous. Discipline and awareness matter more." The young man looked around, suddenly aware of the crowd, of the royal guard, and of the embarrassment he now felt. People who had been cheering or whispering were now watching him with a mixture of pity and admiration for the veteran. He realized he had been reckless, and the lesson was unmistakable. The veteran took a few steps back, giving the thug space. His calm posture and steady breathing were a quiet demonstration that the situation was over, that no further action was needed. The young man's fists slowly unclenched, his shoulders sagging slightly. The anger and frustration were still there, but now they were tempered with respect, a reluctant acknowledgement of the veteran's control. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, sharing their thoughts quietly. "He didn't even hit him," one woman said. "And yet the young man looks like he's learned a lesson." A man nodded. "Experience and calm are more powerful than aggression. I've never seen anything like this." The royal guard subtly adjusted their stance, recognizing that the veteran had handled the situation perfectly. They had trained to maintain order, but this was a demonstration of skill and control that went beyond their usual experience. The veteran had taken what could have been a dangerous confrontation and resolved it without unnecessary force, setting an example for everyone watching. The thug finally lowered his head, breathing heavily. He had been put in his place, not through violence, but through discipline and awareness. The lesson was clear. Aggression without control was meaningless, and underestimating someone with experience could lead to humiliation. He stepped back slowly, avoiding further provocation, his pride wounded but his respect earned. The crowd began to relax, some applauding quietly, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. The tension in the square began to fade, replaced by a sense of admiration for the veteran. Children pointed and whispered, "Look, that man is so strong and calm." Tourists exchanged smiles, realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The veteran remained calm, standing tall, his posture relaxed but controlled. He did not gloat, he did not boast. He simply walked away slowly, blending into the crowd, leaving the thug and the onlookers with a lesson that would not be forgotten. The royal guard gave a subtle nod of respect, acknowledging the veteran's skill and composure. In that moment, the square returned to its usual rhythm, but the story of what had just occurred lingered in the minds of everyone present. The veteran had demonstrated something far more important than physical strength. He had shown the power of discipline, calm, and control. The palace square was slowly returning to its usual rhythm, but something about the air had changed. The crowd that had gathered around the confrontation had begun to disperse, yet whispers of the incident lingered, echoing in small groups of onlookers who exchanged stories and speculation. People were still pointing toward the space where the veteran had stood moments before, talking about what they had witnessed. Some were in awe, some in disbelief, and some were simply smiling, realizing they had witnessed an extraordinary lesson in calm, control, and discipline. The thug had stepped back, his chest still rising and falling from the exertion and tension of the encounter. He looked around, suddenly aware of how many people had been watching, and a wave of embarrassment washed over him. His aggression had evaporated, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that he had misjudged the veteran completely. Pride, which had once fueled his anger, now seemed muted, tempered by the understanding that he had faced someone far beyond his experience. The veteran moved through the square with slow, deliberate steps. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back to check if the thug was following or if the crowd was watching. His posture remained straight, composed, and controlled. Each step was a demonstration of confidence without arrogance, of strength without aggression. People began to part slightly as he walked by, sensing the presence of someone remarkable. Even the royal guard, who had returned to their positions after the incident, shared quiet nods of respect among themselves. They understood that the veteran had handled a potentially dangerous situation with skill and restraint, a feat worthy of admiration. Nearby, some of the bystanders began to discuss the event in hushed tones. "Did you see how calm he was?" one man whispered. "The young man was swinging with all his might, and yet he didn't even touch him." A woman nodded. "It's amazing. He didn't have to fight to prove anything. That was pure discipline." Children, who had watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, began to ask their parents questions. "Mom, Dad, why didn't the man fight back?" "Because sometimes strength isn't about hitting someone," the parent replied gently. "It's about knowing what to do, staying calm, and not letting anger control you." The children thought about it for a moment, clearly impressed. The thug finally adjusted his stance, still breathing heavily, but no longer in anger. He had learned an important lesson, though it was one that came in a moment of humiliation and self-reflection. He realized that aggression alone could never defeat someone who had discipline, patience, and experience. Every strike he had thrown had been anticipated, redirected, or rendered ineffective, and he now understood that the veteran's calm presence had been a shield far stronger than any fist. His mind raced as he replayed the moments in his head, the precision of the veteran's movements, the way he avoided every attack, and the quiet authority in his words. He had been put in his place without even realizing it at first, and now the lesson had sunk in fully. Around the square, tourists continued to marvel at what they had witnessed. Some took photos of the spot where it had happened, as if to remember not only the location but the incredible display of calm skill and experience. Street performers resumed their acts, but with a quieter energy, aware that something unusual had just taken place. Vendors resumed selling souvenirs, but their conversations were punctuated with glances toward the veteran, who had now moved further along the square, blending into the flow of ordinary pedestrians. The royal guard had resumed their positions near the palace gates, but their attention remained subtly alert. Even in their routine, they had been reminded that the presence of a disciplined individual could change the course of events without the need for violence. One guard whispered to another, "That man didn't raise a hand, and yet he controlled the situation completely." The other guard nodded, recognizing that sometimes true authority comes not from uniform or badge, but from experience and composure. Meanwhile, the thug's demeanor had changed completely. He kept his eyes on the ground, his fists relaxed at his sides. He muttered under his breath, reflecting on what had happened. "I thought I could scare him. I thought I was strong, but I was wrong," he said quietly. His tone had lost the arrogance it had once carried. In that moment, he realized that true strength wasn't about anger or dominance, but about understanding, patience, and control. The lesson he had learned was humbling, but it was a lesson he would never forget. The veteran, meanwhile, continued walking through the square, observing the environment around him without engaging further. He didn't gloat or boast. He didn't need to. The events had spoken for themselves. He had demonstrated that discipline, calm, and awareness could resolve a confrontation more effectively than aggression ever could. People who had witnessed the incident would carry the memory of his composure for a long time, and the lesson would quietly spread through stories, whispers, and conversations for weeks to come. Some of the bystanders approached the veteran cautiously, not to challenge or confront, but to express their admiration. "Excuse me, sir," one young man said, hesitating slightly. "That was incredible. You didn't even fight, and yet you stopped him completely." "How did you do it?" The veteran smiled gently, nodding politely. "I've learned over the years that control is stronger than anger," he replied softly. "If you stay calm and aware, you can handle situations without unnecessary conflict." The young man nodded, impressed, and thanked him before returning to the crowd, carrying a story he would tell for years. Even the children who had witnessed the encounter were still wide-eyed with curiosity. They tugged at their parents' hands, asking questions about discipline, bravery, and the importance of staying calm. The veteran's actions had inadvertently become a lesson not just for the thug, but for everyone present. People began to discuss the importance of patience, observation, and careful thinking, rather than reacting impulsively or with anger. The event became more than just a confrontation. It became a quiet teaching moment for an entire crowd of onlookers. The thug, meanwhile, began to retreat slowly from the square. He didn't run and he didn't act out of fear, but he understood instinctively that the lesson had been learned. He walked away, head slightly lowered, aware that he had been defeated not through violence, but through skill, patience, and experience. In the days that followed, he would remember that moment repeatedly, the way his aggression had been neutralized, the way he had stumbled despite his strength, and the way he had been taught humility without being hurt. The square itself returned to its familiar rhythm. Tourists continued taking photos, street performers resumed their acts, and the vendors returned to their normal routines. But the memory of the confrontation lingered, quietly inspiring respect for discipline, calm, and awareness. People shared the story with others, recounting how a potentially dangerous moment had been diffused through skill rather than force. The veteran's actions became a symbol of how patience, Observation and experience could triumph over reckless aggression. The royal guard continued their watch near the palace gates, maintaining their usual stoic presence, but even they could not ignore the lesson demonstrated. They had seen discipline and authority in uniform countless times, but the veteran had shown them something different: how an individual could command respect through calm and controlled action alone. It was a reminder that courage and wisdom often work hand in hand, and that sometimes the most effective defense is not confrontation, but careful management of the situation. The veteran eventually left the square, disappearing into the flow of ordinary pedestrians. Yet his presence lingered in the minds of those who had watched. Children whispered about the man who didn't fight but still controlled the situation. Adults shared the story with friends and family. Tourists posted it online, making small notes about the incredible calm and skill demonstrated in a public setting. Even those who had been neutral onlookers were affected, realizing that the story was not about aggression, but about the quiet power of discipline, patience, and self-control. As the day moved toward evening, the square gradually emptied. The sunlight faded, shadows lengthened, and the energy of the crowd softened. Yet the memory of the confrontation remained, a quiet reminder that sometimes strength is shown not through force but through composure, awareness, and wisdom. The thug had learned a humbling lesson, the crowd had witnessed something extraordinary, and the veteran had demonstrated the true meaning of control. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly but persistently. People recounted the incident as an example of courage and discipline. The lesson was simple but powerful. Aggression without awareness is powerless, and experience combined with calm can resolve conflict in a way that force never could. The veteran's actions became a quiet symbol of patience and authority, a demonstration that true strength comes from within, and that composure in the face of chaos can leave a lasting impact. And in that square beneath the fading sunlight, life returned to its usual rhythm. Children played, tourists wandered, and the royal guard maintained their watch. But somewhere in the minds of those who had been present, the memory of a calm veteran standing tall in the face of reckless aggression remained, a reminder that true strength is not measured by fists, but by the power to remain steady, aware, and in control, even when the world around you grows chaotic.